Most organizations today are operating with this industrial era hangover, right? And what I mean by that is that during the industrial era, we were all obsessed with error prevention and replicability. And of course, if you are leading a manufacturing plant today, those are still your primary goals. And if those are your primary goals, please do not do anything we talked about today. But in a growing number of teams and organizations, the primary goal, the primary risk is no longer making a mistake. The primary risk is not innovating fast enough or not having a flexible enough environment to react when something like COVID hits us out of the blue.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of The Future of Work with Jacob Morgan. My guest today is Erin Meyer. She is the co-author of No Rules Rules, Netflix and the Culture of Reinvention, which she co-authored with Reed Hastings. She's also the author of The Culture Map and a professor at INSEAD. Erin Meyer, thank you for joining me today.
So nice to be here with you, Jacob.
So lots of questions for you today about the book. As I was talking before I hit the record button, I mentioned I interviewed Mark Randolph, who was the first CEO of Netflix. I interviewed Patty McCord, who helped create that famous Netflix culture deck. So I feel like I know so much about the company and about Netflix. So I'm really, really excited to talk to you too. Kind of like completes the Netflix puzzle, the trifecta. Why don't we start with a little bit of background information, just about you, and how did you even get involved with the work that you're doing, and how did you get connected with Netflix to write this book?
Oh, yeah. Well, that's actually kind of an interesting story. So my first book, The Culture Map, was all about national cultural differences around the world. And I had this book, The Culture Map, that came out in 2014. And it was kind of a slow starter. So later on, it turned into, we got a lot of readers, but not at the beginning. And one day I woke up and I checked my email. And there was an email that said, the subject line said Peace Corps. And the email then said, "Hi, Erin, I was a Peace Corps volunteer like you were near the place where you were. My name is Reed. I'm the CEO of Netflix." And he went on to then say that he'd read the book. He was excited to start using it at Netflix. And we started collaborating together around national cultural differences. And that was before the Netflix international expansion, which happened in 2016. So that as they were getting ready for this international expansion, I was working with them a lot. And eventually, because their corporate culture is so strange and really just totally unusual, I became really interested in studying that also. And finally, I did that, and I wrote a book with Reed Hastings, with the founder and CEO, about that.
So this was almost a decade ago, but literally you just woke up and you see an email in your inbox from Reed who's like, "Hey, I'm the CEO of Netflix. Let's talk."
Yeah, well, it wasn't a decade ago, just 6 years ago, right? And I have to tell you, because well, the way he wrote the email, I almost felt it wasn't real. I said to my husband, "Do you think this is actually him?" But it was him. And I went on then, I conducted a big research project. I interviewed about 200 employees at Netflix, and I spent a lot of time with Reed himself trying to understand what it was about this organizational culture that was breeding so much innovation and flexibility in the company. And then what it was that other business leaders around the world, or even just team leaders, could learn from this company about how to be more innovative and flexible themselves. And that's what we wrote the book about.
So when you first got into Netflix and you got exposure to the culture and the people there, what were some of your first impressions when you started working with the Netflix team?
Yeah, well, actually, even before I started working with the Netflix team, I was quite startled by their corporate culture. So many of your listeners may be familiar with the Netflix culture deck, which is this set of slides that was released onto the internet, in 2009, I think, has now been downloaded over 20 million times.
Crazy.
And Sheryl Sandberg claimed that this was perhaps the most important document to ever come out of Silicon Valley.
Wow.
And I also, had seen this slide deck, and there are some things in it that I was really taken aback by. So one of the slides, for example, says, at Netflix, adequate performance gets a generous severance. And that concerned me. It concerned me because at INSEAD, where I teach, there was so much talk, and still today, of course, about the idea of focusing exclusively on psychological safety in the
Yeah.
workplace. And I just didn't understand how an organization today could be running around, not make your employees feel safe, but tell your employees if they're not excellent, they're out.
Yeah,
Right?
it's intimidating, right? Because it sort of makes it sound like, I mean, I don't know any other company that says that, but it really does make it sound like unless you are amazing, you're going to get kicked out. And the first thing that comes to mind is, okay, I'm going to be overworked, I'm going to get burned out, I'm going to like have to play office politics, I'm going to have to backstab people, like I'm going to have to do whatever I can to like climb my way to the top. Is like the first thing I think that pops into a lot of people's minds.
Yeah, it sounds pretty startling, and I
Yeah.
think just to have a company speak with that level of bluntness, that's actually one of the things that I loved about it. I was so tired, just so sick of looking at corporate cultures, what companies said their corporate cultures were, and then say, oh, it's about integrity and respect and excellence. There's nothing wrong with saying that your organization values respect. It's just that there's no good, credible option to respect, right? I
Yeah.
mean, no company would run around saying they value disrespect
Yeah.
or that they valued corruption. Right?
Yep.
And I think that was actually one of my really overarching learnings to this research was that if you really want to articulate a corporate culture that means something, that takes root and impacts the way your employees are behaving, that you really want to avoid speaking in absolute positives like integrity or respect that have no good opposite option, and instead focus on the tensions or the dilemmas that your employees are facing on a day-to-day basis. And here we can clearly see, we can talk about this more later, but that what Netflix calls talent density. So talent density is about having really the best employees in a small workforce. That talent density is in tension with security, right? With employees feeling secure. But I love a company that dares to make a choice. And I think that when
Yeah.
a company dares to make a choice with these tensions or dilemmas, that's when we really can see the corporate culture impacting the behavior of everybody.
Yeah, the other annoying thing that I found in a lot of companies, and I'm sure you've seen this as well, is that sometimes they have these values, but they're just words. Treat the put the customer first, treat people fairly, integrity, collaboration. Yet somehow these organizations have the most disengaged employees, their productivity's down, their revenue's down, like the reviews are terrible on Glassdoor, and you're thinking, wait a minute, but your values are totally like against. So I find that a lot of organizations, they have these things just as words on paper, but they don't actually live them. And that's perhaps the most annoying thing, right? Is it's sort of like, on paper, everyone always wants to seem amazing, but then when you actually get involved in that, the relationship, so to speak, you really get the truth that it's really not what the company says it is.
Yeah, and I think that this is where we can really see the value of speaking in tensions or dilemmas when you're defining your corporate culture. Let
Yeah.
me give you a dilemma. Like here's one that I've been asking my students a lot. Imagine that you are leading a team of 8 marketing specialists and you have a great team, really good collaboration, everything's going well, but you are in discussions. The only thing that's worrisome is that you are in discussions with your own boss about a possible organizational restructuring. And if that happens, right, if this takes place, it's going to have a big impact on your team, right? People are going to lose their positions, they'll go to other departments, they'll have new bosses, they might even lose their jobs, right? Now you don't know if it's going to happen. If it's going to happen, it'll be, let's say, in 4 months. Maybe 60% chance likely to happen. So the question I ask my students then is, are you going to tell your employees now? Are you going to tell your team now that this might happen? And of course, people have a lot of differing views about this, right? Some people say, well, no, I'm not going to tell them because they'll get unsettled and people will start panicking. And some people will say, well, of course, I'm going to tell them because I want them to know they can always trust me to be transparent with them, right? And of of course, either of those options, what we will call organizational transparency, here is in tension with workplace stability, right? And either of those options are fine. The problem is when an organization says, here in this company, we value transparency. But then the managers in the organization choose, no, I'm not going to tell my staff because I don't want to upset them, right? And there we can really see that a word like transparency is not an absolute positive.
Yeah.
And often we have to make tough choices. But if you say you value transparency, your managers better be ready to take bold steps in order to make that transparency happen. And that's what really makes the culture come alive.
Yeah, and that's actually another buzzword, right? People say transparency, but then it's like, how transparent are we talking? Like, are you really transparent? And I think a lot of leaders out there are not comfortable with the level of transparency that you're talking about. The other thing that I was thinking of is, and I always use this example when I'm giving talks to organizations, is that Netflix is one of the few organizations that's honest about what it's like to work there. You know, all these other companies are just, you know, it's BS left and right. Oh yeah, managers love you. You get workplace flexibility, great tools. And then you show up and you're like, what the hell's going on here? Like, I'm blatantly lied to. But Netflix is honest, right? You're going to work hard. You need to be amazing. We're going to pay you really well. We're going to take care of you. But, you know, this is not the type of an organization where you're just going to show up and be average. Like, we want amazing people. And if you are an amazing person, you'll be set here. But Netflix is honest about that. They're upfront about that, which I really like.
Yeah, they're not afraid to say really bold things, but that then just lives in the organization. I think one of the things we need to think about as we're getting into kind of this crazy methodology that they're using there, but is this image of we are a team, not a family, right? And what kind of team are we? Well, we're an Olympic team. And of course, on an Olympic team, we fight to have, you know, cohesion and teamwork, but there's no job security, right? I mean, you're excited when you get that spot, and you know that you're going to have that spot just as long as you are the best person for it, right? And as soon as you are not, then you're going to be swapped in for someone else who's now the best person for that team. And I think that's actually such a key image as we're moving away from the industrial era and trying to figure out how to work better in the creative era. Because in the industrial era, often it was employment for life, right?
Yep.
We were a family. But today with COVID and, you know, things changing constantly, we can't have teams where we can't easily move people on and off. And you're right, here is one company that was ready to be honest about that, but then people opt in, right? They know, okay, I want to work for an Olympic team. Or you know what? There's no way I want the stress of working on an Olympic team. I think I'll go over here and work for a family, which is fine too.
I like that analogy of an Olympic team, like not just a team, but an Olympic team, like the very best. That's a very, very good visual. So I mentioned that as I was going through the book, I took a ton of notes, but there is a framework of how the book was constructed. And so before I jump into the specific questions, I thought we could take a step back and you can give us an explanation of what these three pillars are of the Netflix culture, and then we can dive into each one of those in more detail.
Yeah. So the first time that I interviewed Reed Hastings, he told me a story about his first company, which was a company called Pure Software. And when he opened Pure Software, at the beginning, it was just a small entrepreneurial group of people who were operating, let's say, fast and loose. Right. And what I mean by that is that there were no processes or policies telling people what they could or couldn't do. They were all just using their best judgment to make good decisions for the benefit of the company. Right. And there a lot of creativity. Everyone loved working there. But then the organization started to grow. It grew to a couple of hundred people, to a couple of thousands of people. And as it grew, some people did stupid stuff. And some people took advantage of the freedom that was allotted to them. So, for example, there was this one guy named Jim who used to fly every week from San Francisco to LA. Well, there was no travel policy telling him how he could fly, so he started flying first class. And there was this woman named Charlotte, and she had this big dog, and there was no policy saying that she couldn't have a dog at work. So she brought the dog to work every day. And one day he chewed a big hole in the conference room carpet. Now, as these things happened, Reed got frustrated because his company didn't have much money. So he sat down with human resources, right? And together they created this employee handbook. And in the handbook were lots of rules and guidelines, like, no dogs at work, right? Detailed travel policies. Now, as those rules and procedures started to take root, something else happened, which is that the more, let's say, creative, kind of mavericky thinkers in the organization, they started to leave. Because those people, like the really creative, the most creative people, they don't like generally to work in places where they can't run free,
Yep.
right? So as that happened, the Pure Software stopped innovating. And in fact, it got so bad that Reed eventually had to sell the company, right?
Wow.
So when he opened up Netflix, which was his next company, he had these two kind of guiding principles. And the first was employee freedom breeds innovation. And the second was process kills organizational flexibility, right? Maybe I didn't tell that part of the story, but the other issue in Pure Software was that when the company needed to change direction, the employees were so good at following the process and rules that they just weren't flexible enough to kind of like drop what they were doing and go off in another direction, right? So those were his overriding premise with Netflix, but he also had some concerns, as I guess your listeners do, which is that he
Yes.
worried that as the company grew large, if he didn't put processes in place, that the organization would descend into chaos. So he finally came up with some ideas, and the first was, you know what? In most organizations, the most of the procedures and process are put in, the control mechanisms are put in place to deal with those employees who are kind of medium or maybe not poor, right? But the best employees, they don't need to be controlled.
Yeah.
And in addition, if we could get so what if we could get a culture that was made up only of top employees? Then I could give them a lot more freedom, and that would breed a lot more innovation.
Yeah.
But I might still have employees who try to take advantage of the freedom that's allotted to them. So what if I tried to create a culture where everyone was giving one another a lot of candid feedback and we became accountable to one another? And then someone would say, hey, Jim, I don't think it's okay to fly first class every week, right? So if I had those two things in place, perhaps I could offer an unprecedented amount of freedom to my employees. And that was kind of the framework. So increase talent density. That means less employees, but more talent. Increase candor. Right? Get everyone giving a lot of candid feedback to one another, and then remove management controls and give your employees more freedom.
So that's the first, I guess, pillar or framework, right? Talent density.
Oh yeah, so talent density is number one. Should we start there?
Yeah. Well, why don't we do an overview of what the three are, and then we'll jump back to the
Okay.
second one. So if talent density is one, what was the second one?
Okay, so talent density is one, and talent density basically means we hire less employees, but we pay them more.
Okay.
So for your listeners, practically that means, let's say I have 5 open positions on my sales team, and I can hire 5 pretty good people.
Yep.
But I could also pool all of that money together and hire one rock star. Right? That's the rock star hiring principle. So the idea is hire the rock stars, and then you will have more talent density in your organization, but less employees. So that's one.
Okay.
And then number two is getting lots of candid feedback, going back and forth between employees and up to the boss. And number 3 is then removing those management controls, such as no KPIs, no approvals necessary, no vacation policy, no travel policy, all of those things that most companies use to really, tell their employees what they are and are not allowed to do.
Okay. So the entire basically Netflix culture was built on those 3 pillars of talent density, of freedom, and of what was the third one? No controls.
Yep. Hmm.
Okay.
Yeah. So talent density, candor, freedom.
Oh, candor, talent density,
Yeah.
candor, and freedom. Okay. So some specific questions that popped into my mind as I was going through the book. I think it was near the very beginning of the book. You had this really interesting framework, and I think it was the keeper test that managers use at Netflix. And I guess this would fall into the talent density bucket of it. But can you go over what that question is? Because I think a lot of leaders out there, this is an important question for them to ask of their teams. But I also think it's important if you're not a leader to get into the mindset of how your leader would answer this question about you.
Yeah. So this is quite provocative. It goes along with the adequate performance gets a generous severance. But basically, the deal is that if your goal is to create a high performing team, then you can't let kind of middle performers hang around, right? Because if you do, it just tells your high performers that you're not really serious about creating that kind of top work environment. And of course, you can't give that level of freedom to your employees if
Yeah.
you don't have top people on the team. So the keeper test is a simple mechanism that you or I or any manager can use, and that's that you maybe every 6 months or every 12 months, as a manager, you ask yourself a question. You imagine that each person on your team is coming to meet with you. So here comes Stan, for example, and Stan comes into your office, and Stan says, boss, I'm sorry, I have to tell you, I'm leaving the company. Right? I have another job somewhere else. And the question that you ask yourself is, how will you feel when Stan tells you that he's leaving? Will you be devastated? Will you say, oh my gosh, Stan, don't leave me? Right? Anything. Will you fight hard to keep Stan? And if you'll fight hard to keep him, that's clear. He's the right person for that team.
Yeah.
Right? Or maybe would you feel a little bit relieved thinking about the fact that now you could focus your attention on your high performers and stop wasting so much time on one individual? And if so, well, it's really clear that you need to make a tough decision.
Yep.
So that's the keeper test. You do that about each of your employees. And they also do something that at Netflix that I think is kind of crazy, but also is quite interesting, which is you might do a keeper test prompt, which is that you might go to your boss, like if you're my boss, Jacob, and I might say, Jacob, I just really want to know, if I were told you I were leaving the company, would you fight to keep me? Right? And then you'll know, right? You'll know if you are the best person for that Olympic team or not.
That's a tough question to go ask your leader, because if they say no, you're probably going to be. I could see there too. Some people would be motivated to be like, "Oh no, okay, but I better try harder," and other people are just going to be like totally crushed and just, "Oh my God," hanging their head down. I shouldn't be here, and yeah, it's a tough question to ask.
That's right. And I did interview, a lot of employees who did ask those questions. And I can tell you they didn't sleep very well the night before, right?
Yeah.
Because you're thinking, oh my gosh, what's my boss going to say? But I had one person who said, no matter what, the outcome is positive. Because if your boss says to you, of course, Jacob, of course, I would fight to keep you. Well, then you have nothing to be worried about.
Yep.
And if your boss says, I think so, but I also had a couple of doubts, and then he tells you those doubts, well, that's great that you know now, right? And if your boss says, you know what, I got to tell you honestly, I wouldn't fight to keep you. It's also, I think, really important that we have that information. Well, what can I do to improve then? Or maybe I'm not in the right role. Maybe we can find a better job where it's a better fit, right? So it really encourages, I think, those courageous conversations that so seldomly happen in organizations.
How do you keep employees from being burned out in that kind of an environment? Because as we know, for Olympic athletes, for superstars on any particular team, eventually they get to a point where, maybe they get injured and they can't play anymore, or their performance drops and they get like keeping up at that kind of level for a long period of time is really, really hard. And I can imagine there, probably creates an environment. I don't know. You tell me if this creates an environment where maybe a lot of employees are working 60, 70 hours a week instead of 40. They're not sleeping as much. Maybe I could see a lot of the potential negative impacts that an environment like this would create. Did you see that at Netflix?
Yeah. Well, I would say it's an intense work culture. I mean, just like being on an Olympic team is intense,
Yep.
right? But people love their jobs because they're doing work that they choose to do
Hmm.
without having to get approval from those around them. And we'll come to that later. But I think the other key point here, and this is, I think, the most interesting thing about talent density, is that performance is contagious. So when you have a team where all of the employees are top performers and they're all passing the keeper test, generally they're all delighted to be surrounded by stunning colleagues. There's actually this interesting piece of research that was conducted by a colleague of mine at another business school, this guy named Professor William Phelps. And what he did was he invited 4 MBA students into his lab at a time. He gave them a 45-minute task and he rewarded them financially based on how well they behaved. Now, unbeknownst to them, on 50% of the teams, there was an interloper. And that interloper was this actor named Nick. And Nick had been hired to act just like a regular MBA student, but to do things that were not so great. Like sometimes he would put his feet up on the desk and act kind of bored and text his girlfriend. And sometimes he would say things that were a little bit jerky. Like he might say, "Hey, have you attended a business school class before?" Right? And what was so interesting was that Professor Phelps showed, first of all, in study after study after study, that the teams that had Nick on them performed at a 45% worse rate, even when the other 3 MBA students were top of their class. But more interesting than that was that Nick's behavior just seemed to like bleed all over the teams, and the other people started acting quickly like him. So when he was playing a depressive pessimist, the other people on the team would start to act bored or put their heads down on the table. And when he was playing a jerk, it's not just that people would start being jerky back to him, but they'd also start being jerky to one another. So I think that's quite interesting when you ask the question,
Yeah.
like, and it is a question that we should all ask, like, do I want to work at an environment that's like an Olympic team, right? Okay, well, it's going to be tiring. I'm going to have to work hard and it's going to be intense, right? So a lot of us are going to say, no, thanks. I think I'll do some work in the garden every morning, please, right? But then, you have the fact that you are surrounded by these stunning colleagues and you don't have those people kind of pulling you down, which we've seen happens because performance is contagious.
Yeah, even in my book that I wrote called The Future Leader, I was doing some research on just like a toxic leader, and it was similar impacts, right? I mean, if you have a toxic leader, their toxicity, their behaviors bleed into other team members. And similarly, if you have a leader who's very positive and optimistic and treats people well and is engaging and motivating, that too spreads. So you can basically think about it like either a good virus or a bad virus, and which one do you want to have inside of your organization? So I love,
That's right.
yeah, so I think it's very, very consistent for that study, and also the same things that I found as well.
That's right. I think people often think, an individual performance problem is an individual problem, like
Yeah.
between me and that employee. But we know from so much research that an individual performance problem is a systemic problem that impacts the entire team, perhaps the entire organization.
Yep, couldn't agree more. Before we get back to the show, I just wanted to remind you to head over to defineleadership.com to grab my new PDF that is going to walk you through a framework for how you can personally define leadership and why that matters. You will also hear from CEOs and how they define leadership, and you're going to hear from CEOs from organizations like KPMG, Oracle, and Verizon. So again, that is defineleadership.com if you want to grab that PDF while it's available. And now, back to the show. You mentioned earlier this phrase, and this phrase is also throughout the book as well, and that is exclusively stunning colleagues, which, I mean, that phrase in itself is like so intimidating and daunting. How do you or how does Netflix identify exclusively stunning colleagues? So like, is it something during the interview process? Are there specific qualities or traits that make up this kind of a colleague? Like, how do you identify this if you're a leader in someone? And also, if you're not a leader, how do you identify this in yourself if you are that kind of a stunning colleague?
I don't think I have actually an answer to this. I mean, I wouldn't want to minimize what it means to be amazing because
Yeah.
that would really, I mean, an organization like Netflix, who's like, super creative, what they need are all sorts of people, right? People from
Yep.
all walks of life with all different kinds of personalities. There's not like one kind of person. What it means is that you pass the keeper test. Right?
Yep.
Your boss would fight to keep you, right? And if your boss would fight to keep you because you're wacky and make everybody smile all day, and every day you come in with a crazy idea, you're totally disorganized, but your boss will fight for those other reasons. Well, that makes you stunning. Right?
Okay.
If your boss will fight to keep you because you are the most organized person on the team and you keep everybody in line every morning, right? And maybe you're not particularly creative, but you're providing such an essential role to the team or organization. You're a stunning colleague. So I wouldn't want to try to narrow it down beyond that. But I do
Okay.
think when it comes to, and I didn't learn any innovations when I was doing this research with regards to interviewing techniques. And I would say Netflix is doing the same thing that they're doing at Google or
Okay.
Facebook or all the things that they're doing at the big companies. But the one thing that they are doing is this rock star pay, and I'll just maybe explain that a little bit more. So Reed is a software engineer, and I guess some of your listeners are probably software engineers also.
Yep.
And apparently, software engineers know something that the rest of us don't know, which is something about the study that was conducted in the 60s, which led to something that is now referred to on the internet as the rockstar principle. And that principle basically was that if you take 10 software engineers, and all of them are at least adequate, right? At least fine. And you give them a task, right? That on average, the very best will perform at least at a 10 times higher rate than the worst of the 10. Right. And sometimes more than 10 times more. So that's a big gap, right? Having one person who can do 10 times what another does. So that's where we get to this idea that if you can hire 10 employees, right, you could also hire one employee and just pay them the very best. So that's the whole methodology behind
Okay.
hiring. No other innovations there.
Okay. It sounds like for the stunning colleague process, it's also very subjective, right? So if there are a bunch of different leaders at Netflix, what I would identify as a stunning colleague might not be the same thing that my counterpart on another team identifies as a stunning colleague. Meaning that it's not like a performance review process. It's not a series of characteristics or check marks that everybody at the company has to follow. It's very individual to each leader in each team.
Yeah, and remember what we're going for here is an environment that's like a lot of little tiny entrepreneurial companies operating
Yeah.
together, right? So the
Okay.
goal is to avoid all kinds of control mechanisms. And of course, one type of control mechanism that is used at most big companies are like these 9-box methods where you have
Yep.
to rate people in a certain way, and then you kind of calculate a score, and then you determine if they're a high performer or not. Or these horrible systems, I'm sorry to say it, that were used at Microsoft and GE, the rank and yank systems, which
Yeah.
were
Yeah.
other
Stack
methods.
ranking.
Yeah, there were other methods that were used to create high talent density. But with those methods, every manager had to say, okay, this is the best of the 10 and this is the worst of the 10. And that really creates internal competition, right? No one should be doing that because
Okay.
if I think I'm towards the bottom of the 10, well, I'm likely to think, oh, it's either me or Jacob who's going to lose our job, right? So I'm going to try and make you look bad or not share information with you, right? So we don't want that. What we want is an environment where we know that the entire team, all of us, are the best person for the spot. And then if at some
Okay.
point someone becomes not the best person, that person needs to be swapped in and out.
So does Netflix do performance reviews? Do they do annual engagement surveys? Because I would imagine, a lot of people who are listening to this are thinking, okay, well, we do our annual performance reviews, we do our engagement surveys, we get a pulse of what's going on in the company, we see who's a high performer, who's not. So if Netflix is operating as a bunch of little companies, and being a stunning colleague is very subjective to each leader, how do those types of standardized processes that so many companies are used to get done, if they get done at all?
Okay, I'm going to answer your question, but let me first clarify. When I said they're operating like a lot of little entrepreneurial companies, I didn't mean that the organization is not like highly aligned. I mean, Netflix, they have only one product, right? So it's not like they are like divided up into lots of different areas. So what they say is we are highly aligned, but loosely coupled. And that means that we all are collaborating together across areas, but that we don't have processes at the top of the organization that are controlling the various areas. That's really pushed down, yes, to the individual leader.
Okay, got it. That makes sense.
Now,
So are there some standardized processes that all the leaders need to follow, like engagement surveys, performance reviews, regular check-ins with teams, benchmarks to know if somebody's doing well or not?
well, most of the processes that we have at most companies are not at Netflix. And I think, I mean, I'll kind of give you a list of those a little bit later, but I think that the one exception to that may be the fact that they give each other so much feedback, and that brings us to the second bucket, right? And that they have these 360 feedback moments that come up every year. They're non-anonymous, right? But they are giving one another feedback in writing at a certain moment every year. They're not rating people with that, but that is, you could say, a process, right? That's maybe one of the only processes that I've found.
It's interesting because there's been a lot obviously written about 360 reviews, where some people say they're amazing and other people say that they're terrible and they hurt the company and they don't do anything. But it sounds like Netflix believes in this full circle feedback process.
Yeah, so let's transition then from the idea of talent density onto candor. So let me just kind of take a stop and say, okay, so if you we don't have to think about an entire company. I mean, this can be practical for a listener. Like maybe I just have a team of 10. Maybe I have a team of 10 and I'd really like to give my employees more freedom. I don't want them to have to come to me and get sign off on everything and to have me be the one who tells them what they can and can't do. I really want to give them more freedom. And I know if I do that, that's going to create a much more creative environment, and we're going to just be happier and we're going to be more innovative, right? So what's the first thing that you need to do? The first thing that you need to do is make sure that you've got the right person in every spot. And that sounds so obvious, but it means you have to ask the keeper desk. And if you don't have the right person in one of the spots, you have to move them out, right? But now once you've got that high performing team, you can give a lot more freedom, right? And that moves us on to the second step now, which is candid feedback. Because even if you have a top performing team, you still might have people who take advantage of the fact that your vacation policy is take some. Or that your travel or expense policy is act in the company's best interest, right? And that's where this whole idea of creating an environment where each employee sees it as their responsibility to give their colleagues lots of honest, thoughtful feedback about what they can do in order to do their job better. And so that's the second bucket, the candor bucket.
Okay. Patty McCord was telling me this story. I don't remember exactly when this happened, but she was telling me this story that when she was responsible for HR, there was a situation where one employee basically came into her office and they were just complaining about somebody else. This person's not doing their job. They're not that great. Why is that? Why are they working here? And Patty basically says, okay, hang on a second, I'll be right back. And then she goes in the other room and she brings that other person to her office. And then she turns to the first individual and then she says, okay, now tell them everything that you told me. And I mean, does that stuff happen? Like, is that a real
Oh,
thing? Is that
oh,
how
all
candid
the
everybody
time.
is?
Oh no, it happens all the time. And actually, maybe I'll tell you a personal story. So,
Yes.
I also found people giving candid feedback to me. And let me say before I start this that there are some clear guidelines. I call them the 4 A's, the 4 A's of feedback. The first one is that all feedback should aim to assist. Right. So you
Okay.
shouldn't give someone feedback just because you're frustrated and you want to get stuff off your chest, or
Okay.
just because you want to get that person in trouble. You need to think, I think I have some information that if I gave to Jacob, that could really help him do a better job. Right. Okay. Aim to assist. The second is that your feedback has to be actionable. Right. So like
Hmm.
I can't complain about something that you can't, I shouldn't give you feedback about something that you can't do anything about. Right.
Okay.
And then the third is that when you get the feedback, you should say thank you. You should show appreciation. That's the third A. And the fourth is accept or decline. That's the fourth A, accept or decline.
Interesting.
Right? So you
Okay.
don't have to act on the feedback that's given to you. But I will tell you a story. I have a whole bunch of these. The first time that I was doing work at Netflix, way before I started working on this book, I gave a presentation at their leadership conference in Cuba. And there were, I don't know, maybe 500 people in the audience. And I was talking about national cultural differences, which is my first love. And at one point, I came down from the stage and I was walking around. And I think I'll add that I had been a little nervous getting ready for this presentation. It was new material and I really wanted to do a good job. I could like feel my heart in my throat during the whole thing, right? But I felt it was going really well. So I came down from the stage and I was walking around while the audience was having little discussions. And one woman saw me and she gestured me over, right? And I came over, she's talking to her team, right? And she says, Erin, I want to tell you the way you are facilitating the discussion from the stage is totally undermining your totally undermining your point. Right? And then she went
Hmm.
on to explain that I was talking about cultural differences, but I was asking for volunteers and only the Americans were volunteering. So that was, going to ruin my presentation from her perspective. And I remember when she told me that, I was like, oh my gosh, you're telling me that now? Right in the middle of my keynote in front of your colleagues? Right? But after I got the feedback, like, instantly, I shifted from being like panicked to being like, okay, I have 3 minutes before I have to get on stage again, and I better fix this. Right. And I came up with a new method for how to organize the discussions differently. I came back on stage and I started with Brazil and then Japan. And, I got to tell you, that woman, she saved my presentation. So I just love
Wow.
that example because here we really have something totally unusual, right? I mean, how many organizations would you have someone who would dare to give feedback in that kind of situation? But when you
Yeah,
do
not many.
dare, if you aim to assist, it can really help a lot.
Yeah, no, that's a great story. Uh, but I would imagine there's also a borderline between like candid feedback versus just being rude, because I could see certain situations where you're giving feedback with positive intent, so the other person can improve its action. It meets all those things, but it doesn't come across in a nice way.
Yeah.
So how do you balance being candid while also not, I don't want to say not hurting somebody's feelings, but really that's what I'm trying to say. How do you balance being candid without attacking or without hurting somebody's feelings or without the other person taking it personally?
Yeah, and this is where we really have to put mechanisms in place in our organization for the feedback to get out there in a non-hurtful way, right? I mean,
Yep.
okay, this woman, she was like on the edge, and those things do happen at Netflix. I don't know if I recommend that for kind of the masses, but what I do recommend for any organization that wants to get more candid feedback going on is that you all start putting feedback on the agenda, right? So like, let's say that you and I go to a client meeting together every Monday. Well, at least one Monday a month, we should meet after the meetings in order to give one
Okay.
another feedback as to what we could do differently. And if we know we have that feedback meeting, then it'll encourage me to have the courage to speak up, right? And you're not likely to get upset because we set up that meeting so we could help one another, right? The crazy thing that they do at Netflix is these live 360 feedback dinners, right? Which is that they all get together maybe once a year, and they take turns, right? So like over a meal, maybe at a restaurant, right? And if I'm up first,
I like
we
it.
go
Public
around.
place, so you can't make a scene and freak out.
Well,
Smart people.
public enough, you've got your team there, right?
Yeah.
And your boss. And you go around, right? And each person gives, like me, if I'm up first, feedback about what they think I could do in order to do better in my job. And then we move on to the next person. When I first heard that, I thought it was crazy. I thought, well, what's the point? Right? Like, why do you have to drag my weaknesses through the group? But I saw it created a very interesting moment, actually, a very important moment, because it moves us away from all that one-on-one feedback, which may be awkward and uncomfortable. And I don't really know, is it because you don't like me, or is it more about you than it is about me? To really these kind of situations where I can see, well, one person thinks I talk too loud, and another person thinks I talk too softly, and another person and everybody in the group
Yeah.
thinks that this is something I need to work on, right? So I think actually those are some of the greatest developmental types of situations that I saw when I was there.
Well, so that brings up an interesting point. What if you are getting different types of candid feedback from different people and it's not aligned? So somebody says, like you said, you're a great communicator, and somebody else says, you're not a good communicator. Or, or they criticize something else. You're a great communicator, but you're not a great project manager. And somebody says, you know what? You're a great project manager, not a great communicator. How do you balance all that?
Yeah, well, that's why we have the fourth A of feedback, right? Which was the accept or decline. Because if
Okay.
you are in an environment like that, you are going to hear from a lot of people on an ongoing basis about what they think that you could do to improve. But only it's up to you to choose. Maybe you're not going to do 80% of what the people tell you, right? Of what people suggest. But at
Okay.
least if you have that information, then you can make a very informed choice, right?
Okay.
And that's when now, once we have that talent density and we have that candor in the organization, now you're in a position that you can eat your cake. Right.
Yep.
So what I mean by that is that I think when we talked about talent density, I'm sure some of your listeners loved it. And some of your listeners thought, oh my gosh, I do not want to work in a place like that. Right. That's
Yeah.
the spinach. Right? Some people love it and some people hate it. And same thing with candor, right? When we're talking about giving all this candid feedback, I'm sure some of your listeners are thinking, oh, I'd love to work in a place that I got so much candid feedback. And other people are thinking, no way do I want to work in a place like that. Right. That's
Yep.
your mushrooms. Right?
Yeah.
The deal is that if you eat your spinach and you eat your mushrooms, then you get to eat your cake, right? And everybody loves the cake. And what I
Yes.
mean by that is that once you have your talent density in place and you have your candor in place, then you're in at a space that you can really remove all of these control mechanisms that we have in most companies and let our employees just run a lot freer, right? And
Yep.
that's where we really see the joy of this type of environment.
Okay. So one last question for you about candor before we switch to the last one, and
Yeah.
that is how much candor are we talking about? I mean, like totally honest and blunt, and how often? So for example, let's say you're walking down the hall and I say, you know what, Erin, I don't like your hair today.
Oh, yeah.
Or I don't know, just something like, because candor and being critical, I think, they could be very close.
Yeah.
So that's, because you don't want to make sure, or you do want to make sure that it's not just kind of critical feedback, like everybody nitpicking every single thing that you do. And then if you push back on it, they just say, hey, I'm just being candid. I'm just giving you the candor that, is part of the culture. Is that a
Yeah.
problem?
Well, I would say, I mean, I certainly did come across situations even where people did not pass the keeper test because they were not able to give that feedback in a way that was showing appreciation and that was actionable. And they took the candor as a
Yeah.
card to behave obnoxiously to one another.
Okay.
So
And those
that is
people are
not
gone.
what we're those people were gone. Yeah. I mean, actually,
Okay.
I did the research over a year and a half, and I have to say, I know more than one person who lost their job because of that. They also say at Netflix, no brilliant jerks. And I
Okay.
remember one woman coming into my office for the interviews, and I actually really like this woman. She flopped down in the chair and she said, "Oh my gosh, it turns out I'm a brilliant jerk." And she had just received feedback from her boss a couple of days ago that the way she had been giving feedback was not
Mm,
appreciated by those around her. It didn't feel like a gift. It didn't feel
yeah.
like she was aiming to assist. And she worked hard. I remember she worked hard with a lot of coaching from her boss, but about a year later, I came back and I was like, oh, where is she? Where's Caitlin? Caitlin wasn't there anymore.
Mm,
So yeah, that did happen. But I think I'll say one
okay.
thing. I mean, when it comes to feedback, because of course I'm my main expertise is national cultural differences, and what's considered an appropriate way to give feedback in one culture is totally
Oh
inappropriate
yeah.
in
Like
another, right?
Japan versus China versus the United States. I mean, it's
So the guideline that I always give is that, I mean, when you give feedback, you have to think about two parts of your brain. The first is your frontal cortex, and your frontal cortex loves honest feedback. So your
mm,
frontal cortex is the most logical part of your brain, and the frontal cortex would like to. I'd like to tell you, Jacob, what you could do differently, and I'd like to hear from you what you think I should do differently. That's my frontal cortex. One
okay.
research project showed that 72% of employees said that they would like to receive more direct feedback from their bosses, right? That's the frontal cortex responding to that question. Because the issue is that we also have the amygdala. And the amygdala is the most primitive part of your brain. The amygdala is very concerned with finding safety in numbers, right? So the amygdala does not want you to get kicked out of the group, because historically, if you got kicked out of the group, of course, that would lead to death. So if I
Yeah.
give you feedback in a way that seems too direct for your culture, or I give feedback in a way that feels too blunt to be, let's say, appropriate, then my amygdala starts sending off a siren, and that siren physically throws your body into fight or flight, right?
Hmm.
Fight, I deny it. It's not true. You're the problem, right? Or flight, I say, thank you so much, Jacob. Thank you so much for that feedback. And then I hope I never see you again. Or if you're my boss, I say, thank you so much for the feedback. And then I start looking for another job. Right?
Yeah.
So, of course, the goal is to give feedback in a way that nourishes the frontal cortex, but keeps the amygdala calm. And that's why
Okay.
we're having these kind of structured feedback moments where we all know we're going to sit down and I'm going to tell you three things you can do differently, and you're going to tell me three things I can do differently, right? And then we move on. So my amygdala doesn't have to start screaming about losing its place in the tribe. I know we're all doing this together, right? Something like
It
that.
seems like there's a lot of emotional intelligence that's required here. I mean, you need some self-awareness, you need empathy, you need to kind of understand yourself a little bit and understand how you come off, how other people perceive you.
Mm.
Because if you don't have those things, I would imagine this would be a complete disaster for you. You wouldn't be able to succeed in this kind of a company.
Yeah, and I think that was actually the most surprising thing for me was that when I read the Netflix culture deck, it sounded really like a bunch of engineers who were totally lacking emotional skills. But when I started working there, I saw actually the managers there were spending a lot more time focusing on people management and on how to
Okay.
get the feedback out there and how to inspire without giving directions. I mean, very difficult management skills. And if they weren't able to deliver that, then they weren't right for that environment.
Okay, that makes sense. Okay, so let's move on to the last pillar. We only have a couple minutes left, and this is the best part, right? This is the cake, the freedom. So let's give a little bit of background info on this and how does this actually manifest inside of Netflix? I know, for example, there's no vacation policy. You don't need to get approvals for things. So it really is kind of I don't want to say Pinocchio's island, but it's very free.
Yeah, Pinocchio's Island. I haven't heard that before. Okay, that's right. Oh my gosh. Okay. Yeah, so there's three kind of categories of processes or control mechanisms at most companies that you won't find in this type of environment. So the first is, I mean, as we said earlier, the vacation policy is take some. So
Yeah.
every employee decides how much they want to take. But beyond that, the the expense policy is act in the company's best interest. So anybody at any level can purchase a new computer or sign off on $1 million, whatever, a sales deal, whatever they need to do to get things done without getting sign-offs from other people in the organization. So that's the first category. But I would say those are symbols. Those policies, those are just symbols that say, dear employees, we trust that you will behave like adults.
Okay.
And in doing so, then they start behaving more like adults. Right?
Yeah.
The cycle of what we call freedom and responsibility. But then moving on, I think more interestingly is that at Netflix, there are no KPIs. There are no management by objectives, and there's no pay per performance bonuses. So probably most people in your audience don't think of those as control mechanisms, but they are, right?
Well, the KPIs, right away, I was like, what? No KPI. I mean, that's
KPIs.
That's
How could
standard
it
for,
be?
yeah, I mean, that's standard for so many organizations around the world, is everybody says, what are your key performance indicators? What are your metrics? How are you going to be measured? So I'm very, very interested in how the company operates without having KPIs.
But KPIs are horrible for organizational flexibility, right? I mean, the thing is that like in today's world where the environment shifts so quickly, KPIs are the worst, and they're a clear remnant of the industrial era. Right? Yep. In the industrial era, we could set our goals in January, right? And we'd work all year long on the same goals. And when the next January came around, those goals were still relevant. Right? But the problem in today's organizations is if you do an annual KPI, I mean, things change so much and it forces your employees to keep moving in the same direction instead of changing direction with the environment around them. The image is like, it's like a ship in the sea. An organization is like a ship in the sea that builds up barnacles over time. And those barnacles are the processes that tell your employees, what they should do and when they should do them by. People get really good at following those. I know I'm going to be measured in 8 months in this way, and I know that I have to do this, and then I'll get rewarded in this way. But then as the ship needs to change direction, those barnacles make it much slower to move. Yeah. So an organization that doesn't have KPIs or pay per performance bonuses, which are even worse, right, as far as organizational flexibility goes, is an organization that's much more agile, that's much more able to change direction as things change around them.
I love that analogy of the ship and the barnacles.
And then I think but the good stuff when it comes to the freedom is the decision-making approval. Should we move on to that?
Yes, please.
Okay, so because I know you said we only have a few minutes left, and I don't want to not have time for the tree, Jacob.
All right, let's go for it.
So I think the most intriguing thing that I came across during this work was to recognize that at most organizations, the decision-making model is a pyramid, right? So you have the chairman who's like at the top of of that pyramid, who's saying, who's making the big decisions. And then you have the low-level employees at the bottom, and they can make small, inexpensive decisions, but for anything important or expensive, it has to be pushed up the pyramid, right, for approval, right? Yep. And that's, of course, the pyramid comes from the industrial era, right? But at Netflix, they have an image of a decision-making tree. And with the decision-making tree, you have the chairman who's down there in the dirt, right? She's there like watering the roots, right? Setting the direction for the company, saying this is our North Star. These are all of the things we need to be keeping in mind as we're making decisions in the organization, the principles we need to be aware of. And then we have the top executives. They're there at the big trunks of the tree, right? Setting more direction and context, helping their employees make decisions. But then you have the lower level employees employees, like those mid-level or low-level managers who are up there in the little branches at the top leaves. And those are the people who are making the sometimes multi-million dollar decisions on a daily basis. Those are the decision makers, right? Keeping in mind all of the context that's been set for them. So there's two just sayings that we'll kind of wrap up with. One is, don't seek to please your boss, seek to do what's best for the company, right? And the other is, lead with context, not control.
Yeah.
And that's, I think, the image that we can have for organizations of the future, not the bottleneck of the pyramid, but that open and more creative growth of a tree.
I love that. And oh man, so many questions I could keep asking you on this. But I guess people are just going to have to grab the book to learn more. I mean, I took tons of notes. I have like an entire Word doc filled with questions just so people can get a sense of like how much really interesting stuff there is in this book. But maybe we can wrap up on one, and that is for people who are watching and listening to this, if they want to start to create, I don't even want to say a similar culture, because I honestly don't think that a lot of companies would be able to create a Netflix culture, nor should they necessarily. I feel like it's so unique to Netflix that it would be hard for another company like a GM or a Pepsi to say, oh, we want the Netflix culture and let's embrace it. I mean, is that the case? Like, do you get people coming to you saying, we want to be like Netflix, help us?
Yeah, so I want to make two statements. The first, but I'll start by saying, oh my gosh, yes, Jacob. I mean, this is like taking over the world. And I don't mean people are trying to be like Netflix, but what I mean is that people are recognizing, oh, we're still stuck. And before I move on to answer the question, I want to kind of wrap up with that, which is that, okay, I said earlier, most organizations today are operating with this industrial era hangover, right? And what I mean by that is that during the industrial era, we were all obsessed with error prevention and replicability. And of course, if you are leading a manufacturing plant today, those are still your primary goals. And if those are your primary goals, please do not do anything we talked about today. But in a growing number of teams and organizations, the primary goal, the primary risk is no longer making a mistake. The primary risk is not innovating fast enough or not having a flexible enough environment to react when something like COVID hits us out of the blue, right? And if you are on a team or organization where your primary goal is innovation and creativity and flexibility, then these principles are very relevant, not just to Netflix, but to you. And so I will get to the actual answer to the question in a moment, but I'll also say that I think a lot of companies may find that they have some pockets that have both of those in the organization. So, for example, Johnson & Johnson with the Janssen vaccine, the Johnson & Johnson vaccine that came out of Janssen Pharmaceutical, they have parts of that company where they really needed fast innovation when COVID hit, right? And if you need fast innovation, no rules.
Yeah,
right?
For sure.
But they have other parts of that company that are doing the production of that vaccine. And you better well hope they've got a lot of control mechanisms and processes in place in those parts of the organization, right? So we can actually think about our culture in different ways like that. Now I'll come to your question, okay?
Yes.
All right, so your question was, does this apply to our listeners? And what I can tell you is that I don't think that anyone needs to try to be Netflix. And of course, every company will be their own company. But I think that any team leader or department manager or entrepreneur who's interested in really creating an innovative and creative and flexible work environment can just follow these three principles, right? Number one, what's one thing that I could do in order to increase talent density in the company? Maybe I'm not ready to implement the keeper test. Maybe I don't want to do that, but I do think that I could hire one new person instead of three and pay them a lot more and get somebody better. And then what's one thing I could do to get a little bit more candor on my team, to get that benefit that comes from us telling one another what we really think, right? And maybe I'm not ready for the live 360 feedback dinners, but maybe I am ready to start putting feedback on the agenda. Okay, now I've got those two things. And now what's one thing I can do in order to give my employees a little bit more freedom? Maybe I can't get rid of the vacation policy because the whole company is using that. But maybe in my department, I can start giving my employees a little bit more responsibility and saying, you know what, you don't have to come to me to get my sign off on these things, right? You decide,
Yep.
right? And in doing so, little by little, we can all start having more creative and agile organizations, which we need in the future.
I love that. I think that's a perfect way to wrap up. Erin, where can people go to learn more about you, your book, anything that you want to mention for people to check out?
Yeah, please join me on LinkedIn or at my website, which is erinmeyer.com. It'd be a pleasure to have all of you.
Very cool. Well, Erin, thank you so much for taking time out of your day to share your insights and ideas from your brand new book. I really appreciate it.
Such a pleasure to be here with you, Jacob, and with all of your listeners. Hope to see you again soon.
Yeah, likewise. And thanks everyone for tuning in. Again, my guest has been Erin Meyer. Make sure to check out her brand new book, No Rules, Rules, and I'll see all of you next time. Thanks for tuning into this show. I really do hope you enjoyed it. And don't forget to head over to defineleadership.com to grab a copy of my brand new PDF that's going to walk you through a framework on how to create your own personal definition of leadership and why that matters now more than ever. You will also see the definitions of leadership from some of the CEOs I interviewed, including from the CEOs of organizations like KPMG, Oracle, and Verizon. Again, you can get that PDF at defineleadership.com. And of course, I would love it if you subscribe to this YouTube channel for more videos just like this and for interviews with some of the world's top business leaders. Thank you for watching.